Unlike most stepmother stories, my mother was alive and well when my stepmother moved into our house. In fact, my stepmother was my mother's friend, Aunty Uche. This happened over 7 years ago. I was the only child of my parents and almost 12 years old when Aunty Uche moved in. My mother simply told me that Aunty Uche would be staying with us for a while without offering any further explanation. The day Aunty Uche arrived, my parents and I were in the living room watching television when we heard a loud knock on the door. My mother got up to answer it, already knowing who was at the door. Moments later, a fair and chubby woman with long purple braids and an awkwardly short gown stepped into our living room, dragging 2 huge Ghana must go bags and a big box. As soon as she walked in, her strong perfume overwhelmed the entire room. It made me feel nauseous. I froze in my chair, unable to even mutter a greeting. My mother noticed this and scolded me. Ada, why are you sitting there with your eyes wide open? Won't you come and greet your auntie? Reluctantly, I stood up and walked over to greet this strange woman. She pulled me into a tight hug, raining kisses all over my face and gushing about how grown I'd become and how much I looked like my mother. I had to practically push myself out of her tight grasp. As soon as she let me go, she went over to my father and knelt before him, thanking him profusely for allowing her to stay. My father waved her off and said, "Don't worry about that. We are family." Family care, I said to myself. Aunty Uche got up and sat on the nearest couch. She then turned to me and ordered me to go get her a glass of water. I walked into the kitchen where my mother was already making amala and asked her how long Aunty Uche was planning to stay. She simply shrugged and said, "Don't worry, she's only staying for a short while, okay?" 2 huge Ghana must go bags and a big box didn't look like something a person planning a short stay would bring, I thought to myself. As if she had read my thoughts, my mother patted my shoulder with a smile and told me again not to worry. Little did I know that for the next several months, worrying would be the only constant feeling I would have in my own father's house. The following morning, I was rudely awakened by Aunty Uche singing and praying at the top of her voice. It was so loud, you'd think she was trying to wake the entire neighborhood. I glanced at the clock, and it was barely 6 a.m. I laid in bed, wondering why my parents hadn't told her to lower her voice. I got up and prepared for school. My school was a 30-minute walk from home, but thankfully, I had an Okada driver who picked me up every morning and dropped me off after school. Once I was dressed, I went into the kitchen to get my breakfast. My mother had made my usual 3 pancakes and a medium bowl of custard. I carried my plates to the dining table and sat down to eat. Just as I scooped a spoonful of custard into my mouth, I heard the sound of her slippers dragging against the floor. Aunty Uche strolled into the dining area and looked at my food as though I was committing a crime. "All this food for you alone? Look at how fat you are getting. You better slow down," she exclaimed. I paused and looked up at her in disbelief. I only had 3 pancakes. 3, and a medium bowl of custard. I rolled my eyes and said nothing. "So you can't greet, eh?" she barked. "Good morning, ma," I muttered under my breath, barely looking at her. Then I turned to my food, silently praying she would walk away. Days went by with Aunty Uche in our house, and I began to notice a strange shift in the air. The energy in the house changed. I noticed some tension between my parents. I knew they must have had a fight while I was at school. They couldn't even look at each other in the eye anymore. Their marriage had never been perfect. I knew that. They had their fair share of ups and downs, but one thing that always stood between them was my mother's inability to have another child after me. That had always been the main issue in their marriage. Aunty Uche, on the other hand, was the exact opposite. She was so bubbly, humming and singing, moving around the house like she didn't have a single worry in the world, as if she was somehow feeding off the sadness in my parents' silence. I tried not to think too much of it. I distracted myself with school. I didn't want to burden myself with adult problems. But one night, everything changed. It was almost midnight, and I had woken up thirsty. I carefully walked out of my bedroom to the kitchen, trying not to make any noise. I got to the kitchen and grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge. And as I turned around to leave, I heard muffled voices. I froze. The voices were coming from the living room. I tiptoed toward the sound, and through the narrow gap between the living room curtain and the door frame, I saw something that made my heart nearly stop. I saw Aunty Uche and my father cuddling on the living room couch and watching a program on TV. I couldn't move, and my heart began pounding out of my chest. I wished what I was seeing wasn't real. I quietly tiptoed back into my room, shaking in shock. Why was my father cuddling with Aunty Uche in our own house? I was old enough to understand what I had just seen. I wasn't a child anymore. I knew exactly what that kind of closeness meant. But still, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe my father was capable of something like that. Why would he do this to my mom? I wondered. I tried to fall asleep again, but sleep could not come. I laid there, eyes wide open, waiting eagerly for morning so I could tell my mother everything. As soon as morning came and I heard my mother moving around in the kitchen, I jumped out of bed and rushed in to meet her. I began to narrate everything I had seen the night before, but I wasn't even halfway through my story when she hushed me. Shh, that's enough. She stopped me cold. She didn't look angry. She didn't look betrayed or even surprised. Instead, there was this look on her face, a mixture of indifference and helplessness, like someone who had cried all her tears and no longer had the strength to fight. I had never seen my mother so sad. She looked me in the eyes and said, "Go back to your room and get ready for school. And Ada, stay out of adult matters, okay?" I stood there, stunned, wondering why my mother did not react. I wanted to argue, but my mother's tone made it clear that she would not entertain any conversation. So I turned around and went back to my room. I got ready for school and had my breakfast in silence. The food felt like sawdust in my mouth, and all through the day at school, I just wasn't myself. I stared blankly at the board during lessons. I didn't talk to my classmates. My mind was drowning in questions, questions no one seemed willing to answer. The following weeks were like something straight out of a Nollywood movie. Aunty Uche and my father no longer restricted their escapades to nighttime. Whatever shame or secrecy they once had completely vanished. She now walked in and out of my father's room as she pleased, morning, afternoon, or night. By default, my parents stayed in separate rooms. And every time I saw Aunty Uche stroll confidently out of my father's room, even when my mother was right there in the house, it made my blood boil. There was something wicked and twisted about the whole situation. One afternoon, my mother and I were in the living room watching a movie, but the sound of laughter and giggles from my father's room was infuriating. Moments later, Aunty Uche came out of his room, glanced at us, and rolled her eyes as she walked away. I turned and looked at my mother. I gave her a questioning look, but she couldn't even look me in the eye. She stared blankly at the TV screen, pretending nothing was happening, pretending she didn't see the mockery. That was just one of many days, so many typical days in that house. Aunty Uche had quietly but boldly taken my mother's place, and no matter how hard I tried, I could never get a proper explanation. Every time I confronted my mother or asked her what was going on, she would shut me down. "Read your books, Ada. Focus on your studies. When you are older, I will explain. You wouldn't understand now," she'd say. One Sunday evening, my father called a general meeting. What was the topic of the meeting, you ask? Well, he called the meeting to officially introduce his second wife, Aunty Uche, my new stepmother. He stood there in our living room, as bold as ever, as he announced it, leaving a moment of silence like we were supposed to clap or throw confetti or something. He then told us to behave ourselves and welcome Aunty Uche as his second wife and my new stepmother. And as if that announcement wasn't already enough to make my blood boil, he dropped another bomb. Aunty Uche was pregnant. Pregnant. In that same meeting, he made it clear that Aunty Uche shouldn't be seen doing any house chores whatsoever. He told me that from that day forward, I would be responsible for the house chores, and not just that, I was also to assist Aunty Uche with whatever she needed. I couldn't believe my ears. I looked over at my mother. She was sitting there quietly, staring into space like she was no longer in the room, like her body was present but her spirit had gone somewhere far away. I was infuriated, shocked, heartbroken. I tried to say something, but before I could even get a full sentence out, my father shut me up with a thunderous voice and a threatening finger. If you ever talk back at me again, I will beat you. Do you hear me? Can't you see how quiet your mother is? That's how a young girl should behave. When your father is talking, you shut up. When a man is speaking, you listen. Am I clear? Aunty Uche sat beside him, nodding like a puppet and smiling. That day was one of the worst days of my life and marked the beginning of real torture for me in that house. The months that followed are a blur to me right now because somehow my brain found a way to bury the trauma and suffering I went through. My mother became a complete ghost. She was still in the house, but it felt like she no longer existed. She could barely hold a conversation. She didn't speak. She barely cooked. She didn't even move unless she had to. So I did everything. I was the cleaner, the caretaker. I even had to teach myself how to cook simple meals like concussion rice and indomie just to survive. Unfortunately for me, we were on a long vacation from school during that period. No school, no friends, no escape. I was stuck at home in the middle of madness. Auntie Uche made it her life mission to turn me into a maid. She would wake me up as early as 5 a.m. every single day to sweep the entire house and compound, as if that chore couldn't wait till 7 or 8 a.m. like normal people did. No, it had to be done at dawn, when the sky was still dark and my eyes were barely open. She had no problem cooking. In fact, she cooked a lot, and she ate even more. But when it was time to share the food, she'd leave scraps, barely enough for me to call a meal. What she always made sure to leave behind was a mountain of dirty pots and plates. And guess who had to wash all of them? Me. I found myself scrubbing endlessly with soap and wire sponge until my hands and my back hurt. That became my daily routine, over and over again. My mother remained a silent ghost. Within weeks, she had lost so much weight. She stayed locked in her room almost all day. Sometimes I wouldn't even see her at all. Even my own mother couldn't help me. I ran errands, I washed plates, I swept and mopped the entire house. There was barely any time to rest, to breathe, or even pick up my books to read. As for my father, he was hardly ever around, and even when he was, he didn't have a single care in the world. The only thing on his mind was the baby on the way. Every few days, he'd come home with new goodies for the baby. Clothes, toys, feeding bottles, anything and everything he could find. My father was the kind of man that believed that having a son was the highest achievement a man could have. He had always wanted one. After Auntie Uche had convinced my father that the baby she was carrying was a boy, he couldn't hide his excitement. He didn't even acknowledge my presence anymore. It was like I didn't exist. I had become very unkempt. My clothes were often dirty or rumpled because I barely had the time or energy to care for myself. I had also lost some weight. I was always sad. But in all of this, my father didn't care. Not one bit. One day, I couldn't hold it anymore. I gathered what little courage I had and went to meet my father in tears. I asked him if he still cared about me and told him how tired and stressed out I was. He looked at me, then scoffed. "You are not a child anymore, Stop complaining. See, this whole thing was your mother's idea, not mine. He said that and walked away. That moment confirmed to me that I was completely alone. The holidays were coming to an end, and schools would soon be resuming. One afternoon, I approached my dad to let him know I would be needing new textbooks, exercise books, and other school supplies for the new term. To cut the long story short, I wasn't given all the textbooks or notebooks I needed for the new term, all thanks to my stepmother. She didn't stop there. She somehow managed to convince my father to stop paying the Okada rider who used to pick me up from school and drop me off in the mornings. And just like that, I started trekking nearly 30 minutes to school and back from school every single day. It wasn't as if my father could not afford it. He had the money. He was a big trader in one of the biggest markets in town. Business was booming for him. But somehow, Aunty Uche had convinced him that I didn't deserve to be fully provided for. School became a nightmare. I could barely concentrate. I wasn't eating enough at home, so I stopped taking food to school. Most times, I found myself begging my friends to let me eat out of their food during lunch breaks. Still, I didn't know just how bad things could get. Until one day, I almost lost my life at the hands of my stepmother. It was a Saturday evening. My father had traveled for business, so he wasn't home. Aunty Uche called me into the living room and handed me a long list of food items to buy from the local shop down the street. As usual, I didn't complain. I took the money and went on my way. The sun was already setting as it was past 6 p.m. and I walked quickly to the shop. But when I got there, the place was packed. Customers were everywhere. I had to patiently wait for my turn. It took nearly 45 minutes before I could even get to the shopkeeper. By the time I got everything on the list, the sky had gone dark. I rushed back home, sweating and exhausted, and dreading what was waiting for me. As soon as I stepped through the gate, I saw her, standing with her hands on her hips and tapping her foot aggressively on the floor. Her eyes were blazing. She looked like someone ready to start a war. Before I could even open my mouth to explain, she screamed, "Where have you been? You think I sent you to the market to sleep there?" "I'm sorry, ma. The shop was very crowded." That was all I managed to say before she pounced on me like a wild animal. She beat me. She beat me like I was nothing. Slaps, punches, even kicks. I couldn't even fight back. I tried to shield my face, but it didn't help. Moments later, my world began to spin. My head felt light, and then everything went dark. The next thing I remember was the freezing cold. I was drenched in water. My ears rang like a bell. I opened my eyes to chaos, shouting voices, a crowd of people surrounding me. My mother was on the ground, wailing. "You have killed my daughter. You have killed my only child," she screamed, rolling on the floor. As soon as she saw my eyes open, she crawled over to me, gathered me in her arms, and began thanking God for saving me. The neighbors were furious. Some tried to help me sit up, while others turned to my mother in frustration, asking why she let my stepmother maltreat me. My mother had no words. She just kept crying and muttering prayers of thanks. But something had changed. I felt it when I looked into her eyes. The next morning, my mother walked into my room. "We are leaving. Get up. Pack your clothes. We are not staying in this house one more day." I was stunned. She went back and forth between her room and mine. She had already started packing her own things. For the first time in forever, my mother looked like herself again. She looked like a warrior, like a lioness. A few hours later, we walked out of that house with our boxes. My father was not back from his trip, but Aunty Uche sat at the entrance with a dirty look on her face. She didn't say a word. We walked out of the house with our heads held high and didn't look back. We went straight to my mother's brother's house. He welcomed us with open arms. That was where we stayed for a few months till my mother got a job. One day, I asked my mother the question I had always been dying to ask her for the longest time. Mommy, Daddy once told me that bringing Aunty Uche into our house was your idea. Is that true? She looked at me and gave me a bitter smile. This girl, you won't rest until you get answers to all your questions, eh? Well, yes, it's true. I was the one who suggested that she come live with us. What? I gasped. Why, Mommy? Why would you do that? My dear, I don't expect you to understand, but I know you're not a child anymore. For the longest time, your father and I have been having serious problems, especially about having another child, more specifically a son. I couldn't give him one, and for him, that was the end of the world. I stayed quiet, listening as my mother revealed a shocking secret. She explained that my father had made up his mind to marry a second wife who would bear him a son. She got desperate and made the biggest mistake of her life. She told him that if he must marry someone, it should at least be someone she knew and trusted. My mother had chosen Aunty Uche, her friend. She went on to explain that she and Aunty Uche had been friends since they were little. She trusted her like a sister and confided in her. Aunty Uche offered to help, just help. She refused to be the second wife, but agreed to get pregnant and bear a child for my parents in exchange for money. My parents had agreed and welcomed her with open arms. But the moment she stepped into our house, she changed like a chameleon. My mother continued. Her ultimate goal was to destroy my marriage and take over my place. I didn't know she harbored such envy and hatred towards me. She just needed an opportunity to strike, and I gave her that opportunity. I sat there, stunned. I didn't even know what to say. Some time later, we received the news that Aunty Uche had given birth to twins, 2 boys. My father had finally gotten the sons he always desired. The only thing was, the children weren't born normal. They were disabled. They are what people would call imbeciles. I bursted out laughing the day I received the news. Well, he wanted sons. He got the sons he wanted. Good for them. My father came to my uncle's house a few times, pretending to check up on us, suddenly developing an interest in our welfare. He would knock and linger by the gate, asking to see me, begging my mother to come outside, but she never did, not once. She didn't even spare him a glance. The damage had been done, and there was no going back. Eventually, we left my uncle's house and moved into a modest flat of our own. It's been 7 years now, and the last I heard, my father had sent Aunty Uche and her precious twin boys out of his house. Just like that, he discarded them like trash. Rumors on the streets is that he tried to marry yet another woman, hoping to try again for a son, but to this day, he hasn't had a single child. As for Aunty Uche, no one really knows where she is now. Some say she moved to a distant town to live with her sister, but who cares? I don't.